Oklahoma held its first execution in almost 7 years yesterday. Um, Despite getting appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, uh, the 10th Circuit granted a stay of the execution because there is going to be a case in February to determine if our method of execution meets a constitutional definition of not being cruel and unusual. Anyway, 10th Circuit stayed it, Supreme Court overturned it, and they killed a man 30 minutes later. Yeah. SCOTUS Supreme Court overturned the stay, and then Oklahoma executes inmate who dies vomiting and convulsing. So we are on our third botched execution. Not that like the method of killing to me matters much. I mean, state-sponsored murder's bad. Like eye for an eye is bad. I don't know. It just seems like real basic, simple moral logic here. But this one did not go very well, as he was, reacting poorly to the drugs, which are the same drugs apparently that we used in our previous botched execution. So I don't know why we keep thinking we're gonna have different results. So anyway, yeah, that's it. Now it sort of paves the way potentially for Julius Jones, whose clemency hearing is on Monday after getting delayed yet another week. And then his execution is scheduled for November 18th, I believe, is the date. Yeah, I don't have much reactions beyond that. I mean, it's just a grotesque spectacle that we continue to carry out in 2021.
Before I dive in, I'd like to read this from John Grant, the individual who was murdered by the state yesterday. His attorney wrote this, and I'd like to read it to get a better understanding of. He was more than this a paragraph, obviously, but this paragraph will give some context. However, we must not forget Oklahoma's hand in this tragic story. When John stole to feed and clothe himself and his siblings, Oklahoma labeled him a delinquent instead of a desperate and traumatized child left to fend for himself. John wasn't even a teenager yet when Oklahoma sent him to the first of several state-run youth detention facilities. Oklahoma shame would later be the label affixed to the horrors that occurred inside the walls of these facilities during John's time there. After national investigations uncovered years of institutional abuse, John's trauma from these facilities was so deep that he was simply unable to speak about it. What we learned of the myriad of abuses he endured comes from others. Oklahoma ultimately dumped John on the streets with no skills, no support, for the mental illness that was exacerbated by years of being both the victim of and witness to beatings, rapes, and extended periods in solitary confinement, amongst other abuses. When he committed a robbery at age 17, Oklahoma sent him to an adult prison, subjecting him to further victimization, as later documented in a class action lawsuit. Through all of this, John never received the mental health care he needed or deserved in prison. And when he eventually committed a violent crime, the murder of a prison worker, Oklahoma provided him with incompetent lawyers who had no business handling the case with the ultimate punishment at stake. I pray John Grant is at peace now. I pray his death bring peace and closure to Miss Sparta's family. So, they say the ultimate measure of human character is how you treat people who can't do anything for you. I staunchly disagree. I think the ultimate measure of character, and therefore it's the ultimate measure of community, be that a state, a country, a church, is how you treat people who need you. That dictates who we are at the end of the day. And this state, this country, this county, this city continuously fails on the ultimate metric of who we are. That is, we treat the people who need us the most as bad as we could possibly treat them. John Grant, when he was a child who needed us, literally to feed him, We could not. We did not. We chose not to. And so he devolved into a, I don't even say devolved, that's a bad term. So he entered a life of crime to feed him and his siblings. Whenever there's an opportunity to see, okay, well, he is engaging in crime, let us feed him, let us clothe him, let us try to get him off the track of crime. We placed him as a youth in some of the most horrid conditions in the history of modern America for youths. There's that book, There Are No Children Here. You don't go, regardless of how you go into a youth facility as bad as Oklahoma's was and many around this country still are, no children
Yep.
come out. You may go in a child, but no children come out. You don't come out. On the other side of that, you no longer choose to or can be in any regards considered a child. You've seen too much. And so he committed a crime at 17, a robbery. And we, as we had before, we finalized this casting away of John Grant. This is it. Throw you in a prison for decades upon end. Whenever you need us as a child, we couldn't do anything for you. Whenever we saw you entered the system as a child who needed us, we couldn't do anything for you. We chose not to do anything for you. We chose, in fact, to inflict unspeakable horror upon this child. And now you're an adult and you've deviated from these norms again. So we're going to inflict even more unspeakable horror upon you. And I am honest about the fact that while there, after dealing with all this trauma, John Grant, inflicted unspeakable horror upon the victim of the crime, Miss Carter, Day Carter, that led to his, he killed a corrections worker that ultimately led to him receiving a death penalty. In terms of how we treat those who need us, and we're going to get to that with Brittany Poolaw, we fail again, again, and again. And what's most disheartening about that, right, is just in 2016, like I think around like 66% of Oklahoma voters decided to enshrine the death penalty into the Constitution. You say at the beginning of these streams, the beginning of these shows, we are from a notch on the Bible Belt. So at once, these voters call themselves Christians, and at once vote to allow the state to play God and murder people. And I often tell that story about the person who meets from hell, who meets the person from heaven. Mm-hmm. And I'll just run back through it because it's relevant here, and just bear with me. A person from heaven meets a person from hell. And the person from heaven says, describe hell to me. And the person from hell says, well, first off, we got AC. It ain't that damn hot. But secondly, there's a long table, far as the eye can see, and there is a feast. Every food you could possibly imagine is an incredible spread on the table. And they call us all out, and they say, you guys can go ahead and start eating, but you have to use the utensils. And they give us the utensils. And the utensils are big as us. They're 6 foot long spoons and forks, and you can't eat with them. It's humanly impossible. You take the fork, you dig it into the food, and it just goes over your head. And you take the spoon, you put it into your soup, and it just goes over your head. And we have to sit there at this feast, and we can't eat it. It's torture. That's hell. And the person from heaven is like astonished, like, oh my gosh, you pretty much just described heaven to me. I said, well, what do you mean? What's heaven? Well, we come out. There's a long table, just like you described. There's a feast, just like you described. There's even the big utensils, just like you described. And the person from hell says, so like you're tortured too? Like heaven and hell are the same? It's just torture? It doesn't matter? It's like, no. Well, in heaven, we feed each other. I make his plate. I make her plate. He makes my plate. And whatever they tell me what they want, I take the big fork. I feed them to it. I tell them what they want. Take the big spoon. They give it to me. We've decided in heaven to simply feed each other. At every turn, those who purport in this state to be headed towards heaven have decided to not, in any regard, feed each other. They have decided that it's fine for children like John Grant to go to bed hungry. Before the pandemic, 1 in 4 went to bed hungry. It's fine for children who once like John Grant to go to get some of the most inferior educations in the modern world. And after these inferior educations, after hunger pangs at night, whenever they become adults and act as humans, struggle with the things that any of us would struggle with upon having hunger pains, upon receiving or inferior education, we'll finish the job. If they deviate enough, we'll kill them ourselves. But if not, it'll be a slow murder, like they're going to do to Brittany Kulak. And if they are correct, if hooping and hollering on Sundays is enough, in spite of how they vote, how they treat the least among us, how they refuse to feed each other, if the hooping and hollering is enough to get into heaven in spite of their beliefs, heaven is not a place I want to go to. Mm-mm. And heaven is not, if that heaven is not a place I hope John Grant finds himself, though I hope he finds peace. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it's hard to, like, thinking about the victims of the crime, that this is, like, the only option we leave people with. Like, I mean, even in the case of, like, Julius Jones, like I've mentioned this, like, the victim's family even mentions many of the steps that led to that fateful day and how we did not look out for a younger Julius Jones. And I just always think about with terrible crimes and terrible things that happen, it's like we should want to prevent them. We should want to stop repeating these cycles that we know exist, and it's like we don't. And then we wonder why they keep happening.
If you read the Baldus study, which was cited McCleskey v. Kemp, a Supreme Court case in which the greatest bar in the history of the law, of American law, was written, American jurisprudence. It was the Baldus study reveals that black defendants are much more likely to receive the death penalty than white defendants. They are substantially more likely to receive the death penalty if the victim is white. Yes. John Kent is black, Kay Carter is white, Julius Jones is black, Paul Howell was white. And so we cannot deny the racial implications here. In the bar, in the Baldus study, the Supreme Court in McCleskey, after the Baldus study cited, was basically like, yeah, I mean, the study is the study, but we can't overturn the death penalty because that would cast doubt on all of these death penalty cases. And William Brennan writes, it seems this court has a fear of too much justice.
Yeah.
So we can't forget the racial implications of it in that way. Like, again, I say often, both sides of my family come from East Texas. Lynching didn't start in Mississippi, didn't start in Alabama, didn't start in Louisiana. Started in Lamar County, Texas. Just on the other side of the border, Paris, Texas. Roughly 15 miles from the Oklahoma border. So an individual there was accused of raping and murdering a white girl, and the citizens of Lamar County decided we're going to torture this individual. We're going to hang him in the town square for the entire world to see. The governor, Henry Smith, 1893, the governor of Austin, the governor of Texas, I'll mind you, and a very progressive fellow today. So imagine how the fuck he was in 1893. He sent a telegram like, yo, I can't let y'all just murder somebody like this. Yeah. He said no, and they did it. My great-grandfather, many members of my family were there in Lamar County on the day that it was decided that we have to send a message to black people who deviate enough. We have to hang them. And no one was prosecuted. And state-sanctioned murder, be it by citizens and the state refusing to enforce the law, or the state committing the wretched and heinous act itself, is state-sanctioned murder. And me as a black man who comes from there, looks at this and knows, receives, feels in my very bones, like if you deviate enough of this state is determined to murder you. Right? And how he died, 24 full body convulsions, vomiting on his face, it doesn't matter. We have to commit this act. We have to send you this message. We have to let you know if you deviate enough, we will murder you. So
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where, I mean, it all ties together where we don't teach our history and we don't talk about it and we don't explain. Not that I guess some people would care, but I mean, you have to think there would be some folks that could get there if they understood the
I don't
implication.
think people should want to read about something like that. Happy, but I think a quintessential book in understanding America is On Lynching by Ida B. Wells, and it's mentioned in On Lynching by Ida B. Wells, and a lot of the origins of lynching and the motivations for lynchings and their economic motivations from lynching and those sorts of things, often economic and not the slighted reasons you get from On Lynching. It's a quintessential book for understanding American history and why America exists as it does today.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't gonna get. I don't want to get too far into all this, but I did want to bring up there were two polls done in the last month, um, touching on the death penalty. Uh, One was an Amber integrated poll that suggested that a majority or a plurality, no, a majority of people supported commuting the sentence of Julius Jones. Even a plurality of Republicans. So anyway, that is interesting, juxtaposed with one by Pat McFerrin, where he shows a lack, or I guess I should say partisan split in support for clemency, with Democrats overwhelmingly supporting it and Republicans overwhelmingly opposing it. And young people, a plurality of under 45 supporting clemency for Julius Jones. So, I don't know, we talked about this a little bit offline, but there is sort of a grotesque spectacle to all this, and certainly with like the national notoriety that the Julius Jones case has gotten. You know, Stitt sort of had a quiet week, mostly attending business roundtables and ribbon cuttings. He issued just a boilerplate, I swore to enforce the laws, and so I'm going to do this, you know, I'm going to let this thing go. So anyway, I don't know. I don't know what happens. I don't, obviously, probably just being somewhat doomy and negative like many of us feel right now. You know, I don't feel real great about Stitt's decision making on the Julius Jones deal. But I also don't see him probably like leaning into it in any sort of meaningful way, despite the fact that I guess there are a significant number of people that either want it or don't care either way. Anyway,
well, the good thing about that is Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt don't give a fuck about Oklahomans. So I don't know, what does the national polling say about Julius Jones? I feel like that at this point, that's what Kevin Stitt is more concerned with. So, like,
yeah. So I don't know. I honestly, to be perfectly honest, I think these polls are probably just more an indictment of how shitty our polling is in Oklahoma. The fact that they can show such wildly different outcomes. But I guess the "Have you heard of Julius Jones" poll numbers were pretty similar. 46% to, yeah. I don't know. He splits it up. No social media. Who has no social media? Anyway. Yeah. So yeah, here was Stitt. I mean, he literally did nothing this week. Just a bunch of business roundtable stuff. Which is also interesting because obviously this was like the first big week after Joy Hoffmeister announced, which she threaded a needle. I didn't pull up her thing, but her statement was that we shouldn't do killing, state-sponsored killing until we get it right, which is a take, I guess, not a very
Not a
good
fan of the
one.
caveat. Yeah, not a fan of the caveat there, Joy.
Yeah,
Companies should not do state sanctioned killings. The best way to ensure we don't kill any innocent people is to kill no people. The best way to show our humanity is to kill no people because it's wrong. It's wrong for
right.
any entity to any person, any or entity to take a human life. Admittedly, a lot of these individuals on death row have taken human lives. Some of them have not and will be killed anyway. But a lot of them have not taken. A lot of them have taken human lives. By taking theirs, what do we accomplish? I make this offer all the time. A couple offers I make. Here are the two offers I make people. If you can give me a valid reason for the death penalty, a valid reason, I'll buy you a drink. And if you can give me a valid reason to outlaw sex work and make drugs illegal, I'll buy you a drink. No one has ever given me say, well, it's cheaper. It's not. It's not. If you have to build entire wings of death row, you have to give them an extensive appellate process because you don't want to make sure you want to make sure you're not killing the wrong person. In spite of the fact
Which we still do. Yeah.
yeah, what you still do. In spite of, I think it's like 1 in 11 or 11%, one or the other.
Yep.
It's like of people who are wrongfully killed on death row. It doesn't deter crime. You know what deters crime? You know what would have deterred John Grant's crime? If we had fed and gave them quality education, quality healthcare, quality housing, quality nutrition. If we had gave John Gray and his siblings that when they were younger, that would have deterred this crime. So you want to deter this crime? Let's have that conversation. You want to deter this crime? Let's deter the crime that way. But this idea of like John Gray before he committed the acts of violence that he committed did in his mind a cost benefit analysis of likelihood of getting the death penalty or not getting the death penalty was like, okay, maybe I should or should not do this based on getting the death penalty is absurd and just factually incorrect. It doesn't deter crime. It's more expensive. Most importantly, it's inhumane. There is no not cruel or there is no humane way to murder people.